James and Marissa Turner were not supposed to be hiding 6 children inside a filthy storage unit, but when police forced open the rusted door, the horrifying truth shattered the town's quiet facade. Police officers in a quiet town were used to calls that rarely went beyond noise complaints or minor disturbances. On this particular evening, the call seemed routine. A report of strange sounds echoing from a row of storage units just off the main highway. The storage facility was usually silent after dark, a place where people kept old furniture, boxes of memories, or forgotten possessions. But this night was different. When the officers pulled up, they noticed faint scratching noises carried through the night air. At first, it could have been animals trapped inside, but then there were faint cries, soft and irregular, like voices trying not to be heard. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing this was not going to be an ordinary check. Walking down the narrow row of units, their flashlights cut through the darkness. The beam landed on one particular door, a metal sheet with rust creeping along the edges. The sounds grew clearer as they drew closer. There was no mistaking it now. These were the voices of children, but they were muffled, as if coming from behind layers of walls. The officers banged on the door, announcing their presence, expecting someone to open it. Instead, the cries went silent. The quiet that followed was even more disturbing, like the children had been trained to stop making noise at any sign of outsiders. The officers tried the lock, only to find it sealed tight with a heavy padlock. They shouted again, demanding whoever was inside come out. But there was no answer. The decision was made quickly. With bolt cutters retrieved from the patrol car, they clamped down on the lock. It resisted for a moment before snapping apart, the clatter echoing down the row. Slowly, with caution, they rolled up the metal door. The screech of the hinges cut through the silence, and the sight inside froze them where they stood. The unit was pitch black except for the narrow streams of light from their flashlights. At first glance, the officers thought the space was empty, just cluttered with trash and discarded objects. Then the light caught movement. Small, hunched figures pressed together against the back wall. 6 children, their faces pale and eyes wide, stared back like frightened animals caught in a trap. Their hair was matted, their clothes torn and caked with dirt. Some clutched each other, trembling, while others sat motionless, too exhausted to react. The smell hit next, an overpowering stench of waste and rot that made it hard to breathe. The floor was littered with stained blankets, crumpled food wrappers, and broken toys. There was no sign of proper bedding, no sign of any comfort at all. Only desperation hung in the air. One officer stepped forward, kneeling down, speaking gently to reassure the children, but none moved closer. They looked at the uniforms with suspicion, as if unsure whether to trust the rescuers. The silence was unnerving, the kind of silence that comes only from fear drilled deep over time. What had begun as a simple noise complaint had just turned into one of the most shocking discoveries the town had ever seen. Inside the cramped storage unit, the flashlight beams revealed the reality of how the children had been living. The small metal space was barely large enough to hold the 6 of them, yet every corner showed signs of life forced to exist in conditions unfit for animals. A thin, sagging mattress lay in the middle of the floor, its surface stained with dark patches and crawling with insects. Another was pushed against the wall, shredded at the seams as if it had been chewed by rodents. The air was damp and thick, carrying the sour smell of spoiled food, mold, and unwashed bodies. There was no source of light other than the door the officers had opened, and no ventilation except for thin cracks where the metal walls met the ceiling. It was a cage, not a home. Scattered across the floor were empty wrappers from cheap snacks and fast food bags long since hardened with grease. Crushed soda cans and half-filled bottles of murky water sat in piles, some tipped over, soaking into the thin blankets beneath them. A corner of the unit had been crudely designated as a bathroom, with a bucket left uncleaned and overflowing. The smell of it alone was enough to make one of the officers step back, covering his mouth with his sleeve. The children had clearly been forced to use it day after day, with no way to empty or clean it properly. The youngest of the group, a toddler barely able to stand on his own, sat on the mattress with a cracked pacifier in his mouth. His skin was marked with rashes, and his hair stuck to his forehead with sweat and grime. Beside him, two slightly older siblings clutched plastic cups, their eyes wide and hollow as they stared at the strangers in uniform. They looked underfed, their arms and legs thin, their clothes stiff from being worn for days or even weeks without washing. The oldest child, no more than 12, stood protectively in front of the others, his chin lifted as though he had been trying to act as their guardian in the absence of proper care. His small body looked tense, shoulders tight, as if he had been bracing himself for a confrontation every time the door rattled from the outside. What struck investigators most was how silent the children remained. No crying, no questions, no relief at being found. Just silence, as though their voices had been taken from them by the conditions in which they had been forced to survive. The youngest whimpered faintly, but the older ones hushed him quickly, instinctively, as if they had been taught to stay quiet no matter what. There were no toys that worked, only broken pieces scattered on the ground, a doll missing its head, a car with no wheels, puzzle pieces that would never fit together. Everything about the scene screamed of abandonment, not just from parents, but from the entire world. The storage unit, a place designed to hold forgotten belongings, had been turned into a prison for children who seemed just as forgotten. The officers stood in disbelief at what they were seeing, realizing this was not temporary shelter. This was where 6 children had been forced to live, day after day, in darkness, filth, and silence. The parents were found not far from the storage facility, sitting in an old van parked just outside the chain-link fence. From the outside, it looked like any other worn-out vehicle, cluttered with blankets, trash bags, and personal belongings piled against the windows. When questioned, they appeared tired and defensive, but not particularly alarmed by what had been uncovered. Investigators quickly realized this was not a case of children accidentally left behind. This was part of a larger pattern, a way of life carefully hidden from public view. Both parents had once lived in a small rental home on the edge of town. Records showed they had been evicted nearly 3 years earlier after falling behind on payments. From that point, they drifted between motels, cheap apartments, and friends' couches. Each time stability seemed possible, they moved again, leaving behind unpaid bills and unanswered questions. Eventually, when options ran out, the van became their only shelter. The storage unit was rented shortly afterward, under a false name, and was used not for furniture or household goods, but for their 6 children. The arrangement was as disturbing as it was deliberate. During the day, the parents would sometimes bring food or bottles of water, dropping them off quickly before heading out again. Witnesses later reported seeing them in fast food restaurants, laundromats, and even working short-term jobs, giving the impression of a couple just barely scraping by. No one suspected that while they blended into public spaces, their children were being confined inside a metal box with no windows or fresh air. It was a double life, one carefully constructed to keep the truth out of sight. When investigators began piecing together their movements, more troubling details surfaced. The parents had once been involved with Child Protective Services years earlier, but the case had been closed after promises of improvement. They had moved repeatedly to avoid scrutiny, never staying long enough for agencies to build a clear picture. Whenever questions arose about the children's absence from school, the parents insisted they were homeschooling. When neighbors grew suspicious about the constant presence of the van, they relocated again. Each move seemed less about survival and more about avoiding being caught. In interviews, the parents described themselves as victims of circumstance. They claimed the storage unit was only temporary, a last resort until they could find steady housing. Yet the condition of the children told a different story. Their hair, clothes, and bodies showed the signs of long-term neglect, not a few nights of hardship. Their silence, their guarded stares, suggested they had been trained to remain hidden and unheard. The more investigators uncovered, the clearer it became that this was not a simple case of poverty. Many families struggle without resorting to hiding children away in darkness. What stood out was the calculated way these parents managed their lives, presenting one image to the world while concealing the truth in a locked storage unit. It was a carefully maintained secret, one that unraveled only because of a noise complaint that no one expected to lead to such a discovery. As the investigation deepened, authorities began piecing together the many warning signs that had been overlooked or dismissed in the years leading up to the discovery. School officials had noticed the absence of the children long before the storage unit was opened. At first, there were casual excuses offered by the parents: illness, relocation, or a decision to homeschool. Paperwork was never filed, yet the claims were taken at face value, and the children quietly slipped through the cracks of the education system. Months turned into years without a single verified sighting of them in a classroom. Reports from concerned neighbors painted another troubling picture. In one neighborhood where the family had briefly lived, someone had contacted social services after seeing the children playing outside without shoes or coats in the middle of winter. A social worker was sent, but by the time they arrived, the family had packed up and left. In another town, a neighbor recalled hearing loud arguments and children crying late into the night. That report also failed to lead to action when the parents abruptly disappeared. Each time scrutiny grew too close, the family moved again, leaving behind unanswered questions and suspicions. The storage unit itself revealed further layers of deception. Investigators learned it had been rented under a false identity, making it nearly impossible to track. Payments were made in cash, ensuring there was no paper trail to connect it back to the couple. Even the van parked outside had expired plates registered under a different state. Everything about the parents' choices pointed toward a plan to stay invisible, to avoid detection while continuing a lifestyle built on concealment. Former acquaintances came forward with stories that added more context. Some recalled the parents speaking bitterly about government agencies, claiming that outsiders wanted to tear families apart. Others remembered odd restrictions placed on the children, such as not being allowed to speak to strangers or even extended relatives. Over time, the family's world grew smaller, shrinking until only the parents controlled what the children saw, heard, and experienced. It became clear the secrecy was not simply about financial hardship, but about control. As the children were evaluated by doctors and psychologists, the red flags became undeniable. Malnutrition, developmental delays, and untreated medical conditions all pointed to years of neglect. The older children described routines that suggested they had been confined for much longer than investigators initially assumed. They spoke of rare outings, always at night, when they were hurried into the van and driven around before being returned to the dark unit. They described how silence was demanded at all times and how breaking that rule brought swift punishment. The case began to look less like desperate parents overwhelmed by circumstance and more like a calculated pattern of isolation and concealment. What unsettled investigators most was how easily this family had managed to disappear in plain sight. Red flags had been raised again and again, but each one had been brushed aside or lost in the shuffle of overworked systems. By the time the truth came out, the children had spent years in conditions no one could have imagined, hidden behind a metal door that many people had walked past without ever suspecting what was inside. The arrests of the parents came swiftly after the discovery. They were taken into custody without resistance, sitting silently as officers placed them in handcuffs and read the charges. Child endangerment, neglect, and unlawful imprisonment were only the beginning. Prosecutors began building a case that would show not only the physical suffering of the children, but also the deliberate choices that kept them locked away for so long. Court documents later revealed that authorities considered adding fraud and identity-related charges, given the false names and cash payments used to maintain their secrecy. The image of a struggling couple barely holding on crumbled quickly under the weight of evidence that suggested calculation and intent. For the children, the immediate focus was survival and recovery. They were placed into protective custody and transported to a local hospital. Doctors noted malnourishment, untreated infections, and in some cases signs of long-term developmental delays caused by lack of proper nutrition and stimulation. The youngest child struggled to walk steadily, his muscles weak from confinement, while the older ones showed emotional scars that were less visible but equally severe. Nurses described how the children reacted to ordinary things, running water, warm food, or a clean bed, as if encountering them for the very first time. Their sense of normal had been shaped by a dark, airless box, and stepping out into the wider world was both overwhelming and terrifying. Investigators were struck by how the children clung to one another during those first days of freedom. They were bound not only by blood but by the shared experience of surviving in silence together. The eldest, who had taken on the role of protector inside the unit, continued to watch over the younger siblings in the hospital, hovering nearby as if afraid they might be taken away again. It was a role he should never have had to play, but one that had likely saved the younger children from even greater harm. The legal proceedings drew national attention. News outlets seized on the story, and the storage facility became a grim landmark for those who wanted to see where such horrors had been hidden. Commentators debated how such a situation could have gone unnoticed for so long, pointing to failures in the social safety net, schools, and local agencies. Some blamed the system, while others focused on the parents' choices. The community, shaken and embarrassed, organized vigils and fundraisers, vowing that no child should ever be able to vanish in plain sight again. When the trial began, the courtroom was filled with tension. The parents showed little visible emotion as prosecutors presented photographs of the unit and testimony from medical professionals. Witnesses described the squalor, the silence of the children, and the years of missed warnings. The defense argued hardship and desperation, but the evidence painted a darker picture, one of concealment and control. Ultimately, the jury delivered guilty verdicts on the most serious charges. The children, meanwhile, began the slow process of healing in foster care, placed with families who could provide the safety and stability they had been denied. Their futures remained uncertain, shaped by years of neglect. But for the first time in a long time, they had a chance to experience life beyond the walls of a storage unit. The case closed with heavy sentences for the parents, leaving behind a lingering reminder of what had been hidden in silence and how close it had come to remaining undiscovered forever.